So what is Michigan's toughest football game on the schedule this fall? The answer may surprise you. Next on the Michigan Podcast.
There's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in, caught. Waits for it, it's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it, and a touchdown, Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him, and a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle, caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet, touchdown Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming, sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
The MVP in today's ball game. You want to know who it is? I'm standing alongside his proud daddy, the quarterback Brian Greasy of Michigan.
Go Blue, welcome to this week's Michigan Podcast. My name is Steve Deace. We are happy to have you with us. Let us know what you think about what we think. Follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. You can also send us questions that we'll try to answer each and every week here on the podcast. You can also like us on Facebook, subscribe to our channel if you're watching us right now on the YouTube video edition. And by the way, we love you if you are listening to us via podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. Really appreciate that. Appreciate it when you send us notes. Hey, love what you guys are doing. I'm sharing the link with my buddies. That's how we help get the word out. We love it. But we're just saying, if you've never had a chance to watch the video presentation that our team here at the Michigan Podcast puts together, like that intro you just heard, it sounds great listening to it on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play, but it doesn't do it justice. You need to actually see what we produce here each and every week if you get a chance. So check us out on YouTube. And if you're already there on YouTube with us right now, like us, like this video, share it. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as all of our podcasts. Coming up a little bit later on, we're going to take a stroll down memory lane with a gentleman who has seen it all in the Michigan online media age. He has been there, chronicled every Michigan urban legend, and we're going to find out, is it true that Philip Fulmer, when he was coach at Tennessee, was so angry that Charles Woodson won the Heisman Trophy over Peyton Manning, that he voted Michigan so far down his coach's poll ballot that gave Nebraska the margin to win the poll and split the national championship? Is that true? Is it true that a recruit was once committed to Michigan and then got up the next day on signing day and said, hey, I went to bed a Wolverine and I woke up a Seminole? Is it true that Kirk Herbstreit spoiled Les Miles coming to Michigan by bringing it up on College Game Day, and that blew up the whole story? We're going to get into all of that. Kelly Baraka, remember him? Does anybody know where he's at nowadays? We're going to get into all of those Michigan urban legends coming up a little bit later on with someone who remembers all of those urban legends because it was his job to follow up on them. That and more coming up later today on the Michigan Podcast this week. But we start with a ranking of Michigan's 2017 schedule. One pundit recently said it's one of the tougher schedules in the country. So I have gone through and I've ranked all 12 of Michigan's regular season games. We're going to go through them in the order that I would give them a degree of difficulty, from the least difficult to the most, and then I'm going to give you my forecast. Doesn't mean it's not a prediction now, right? What's a forecast? Well, I'm not telling you for sure it's going to rain. I can't see the future. What I am telling you is when I look at the conditions out there, there's a 75% chance we're going to see some precipitation tomorrow. All right, so these are not my official predictions. These are my forecasts of the odds of a Michigan victory in these games. Let's begin from number 12 to number 1. I think the home opener, September 9th against the Cincinnati Bearcats, is the least difficult game on Michigan's schedule. Might not have said this a few years ago. Cincinnati has been for several years now. Mark D'Antonio was at Cincinnati. Brian Kelly at Cincinnati. This has been a program that has been a solid and at times elite under Brian Kelly when they went undefeated that one year, what we call a mid-major program. But they fell on hard times towards the end of the Tommy Tuberville era. They have now Luke Fickell, the former Ohio State co-DC, coming in. I think there's a 95% chance Michigan wins this game. And those are the highest odds I would place on any game on Michigan's schedule, and that's why I rank it the easiest. The next hardest game on Michigan's schedule is Rutgers. Now, I know some of you are going to say, Steve, Rutgers has got to be, I got to believe a Big Ten team is tougher to beat than Cincinnati, although that may not be true of this Big Ten team. My 10-year-old son, Noah, this is still, granted, his fandom is like 3 years, okay? But this is still his most favorite Michigan game. He couldn't get enough. When we watched this game against Rutgers last year that you're seeing the highlights of now, he was like having me rewind the DVR. Daddy, it's another touchdown. Listen, when you get more touchdowns than the other team gets first downs, if you want to make the argument with me that this is the easiest game on Michigan's schedule, plus it's homecoming, so it's at home, you won't get any argument out of me. In fact, I think it's so close. I said we had a 95% chance to beat Cincinnati. I'd put the odds of beating Rutgers at 94%. And I know some of you are going to say, Dace, that's way too low. I know that. The next easiest game on Michigan's schedule this fall is Air Force. Now, I say this even though I'm a huge fan of the triple option. It's one of the most fun offenses to watch in college football. And Air Force, going back now to the Fisher DeBerry days, when he made them perennially a bowl team. They were often a nationally ranked team. In fact, one of Bo's great teams, that 1985 team that finished number 2 in the country. Do you know that season under Fisher DeBerry, Air Force got as high as number 4 in the Associated Press poll? They went 12-1 that year. So I love the triple option. Troy Calhoun's been a good coach, but he is replacing an awful lot. And I give Michigan a 90% chance to win this game. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if it was a little bit like the last time Air Force came to the Big House, and they scared us for a little while, but ultimately just too many athletes for the Wolverines. And that's the biggest antidote to the triple option offense. You just have too many better athletes on the defensive side of the ball. Next up, I'd put Purdue, the Big Ten opener, on September the 23rd. Some crazy stat for Michigan. Is it like 44-2 in their last 46 Big Ten openers or something like that? I mean, it's a crazy number. I don't think we've played at West Lafayette since that rainstorm in Rich Rodriguez's last year, if I recall. Now you got a new coach coming in, Jeff Brom, the former NFL quarterback, who did a great job at Western Kentucky, but he's looking at a total rebuild. And so I would give the Wolverines 89% odds that they will beat Purdue on September the 23rd. Next, in our ranking of the top games, easiest to toughest on Michigan's schedule, I've got Sparty. I think this is a program in a free fall. Something we are forgetting about Michigan State is before we had players dropping racial blasts on one another, before we had allegedly videotaped gang rapes, and then the kid who was the whistleblower gets busted for a sexual assault himself, before we had an offseason where it may be by the time camp opens in a month for Sparty, 11 guys who were supposed to be on this year's 2 Deep have been lost. 11. Before all of that came to light, this team was still 3-9 last year, guys. So before all these distractions were public, they sucked. What are they going to be now that these distractions are public? And that's why I give the Wolverines 85% odds of beating Michigan State on October the 7th. Next, as we run down Michigan's schedule from easiest to toughest, I've got the Gophers, the Little Brown Jug game. Now, these two teams are not scheduled to play again in the foreseeable future because the Big Ten only has schedules running up until through 2019. So they won't play again until at least 2020. So big matchup for PJ Fleck. He's going to get a lot of comparisons to Coach Harbaugh because their personalities are energetic, unique. And I like PJ Fleck a lot. Has a powerful personal testimony of where Row the Boat came from. He's walking into a good situation at Minnesota with a program Jerry Kill rebuilt, Tracy Claeys kept stabilized. Got enough talent, I think, to get to a bowl game in his first year. But essentially, he's going to try to beat Michigan with its style of play with not as good of players. I don't like those chances. So I'm going to give Michigan 80% odds of beating Minnesota and retaining the Little Brown Jug, not just for this year, but it could be for the next several years because, again, the earliest these two teams will play again is 2020. Next, as we rank Michigan's games, sneaky tough, November the 11th at Maryland. Everybody's focused on those last two games for Michigan, at Wisconsin and Ohio State at home. But, man, those sandwich games, how often do we see those sandwich games come up and bite you in the rear, especially on the road? Michigan had one of those last year against Iowa in prime time, a game they should have never lost. I go back to early on in my fandom when Minnesota, we were number 2 in the country, comes in with Ricky Foggy, Darryl Thompson, Chip Lohmiller. Sandwich game, Ohio State the next week, look-ahead spot. Minnesota pulls the big upset at the Big House. I am concerned about this game. So even though I have odds at 75% chances of a Michigan win, if you're looking for an upset, if you're one of those guys who is a golfer and the weather forecast tells you 75% chance of precipitation, but you get up that morning, you look at the sky, you think, I'm going to take my chances that it's not going to rain. This is one of those games where even though the odds are great that Michigan would win, if you're banking on an upset, I'm afraid of this game. It's the game before those other two games. And you got the DJ Durkin factor. You don't know what the weather's going to be like in College Park. Remember, we went there a couple of years ago, and it was deplorable conditions. So that is a game I'm afraid of. Next, as we go through the rundown, another game I'm afraid of. At Indiana, October 14th, another classic sandwich game. Coming off a rivalry game with Michigan State, right before we go on the road for the whiteout against Penn State, which arguably is as important as any game on the schedule this year. And Indiana, the last 2 years, has played us really tough. Probably should have won in 2015. And Jake Rudock, that was the game that got him drafted, basically. He was insane that afternoon. Double overtime, clutch win. And then last year, in that snow, they were there to the end as well in that game. This defensively is going to be the best Indiana team we've seen since the late 80s with Bill Mallory, although I admit that's a low bar. But this is a scary game. These guys are confident. They have many of these same players that we're going to face October 14th have played us tough the last 2 years. So I'll put 70% odds of a Michigan win. But again, if you're looking for potential upsets, this year for the Wolverines is a potential trap game. As we continue the rundown of ranking Michigan's games, I've got the opener against Florida next on September the 2nd. And these two teams are very similar. Both coaches of big-name programs, both of them heading into their third season. Both of them have some questions at quarterback, but for different reasons. For Florida, they're wondering who their quarterback will be. Michigan is wondering who their quarterback should be. Michigan had a kid play very high level last year in Wilton Spate, but a lot of talk that maybe the kid Brandon Peters with a higher ceiling could pass him. Florida is wondering, who do we play? Guys who really haven't played a lot. We talked a few weeks ago here on the Michigan podcast. Malik Zaire has not played a lot of football. Had one game against the worst Texas team in 100 years where they gave up 30 points or more to 8 opponents. And they'd not seen any film of him at all, except for one bowl game against LSU, who didn't see any film of him either because he'd never played before. The next week against Virginia gets hurt, and that's really the last time we've seen him play meaningful football. And then you have Felipe Franks, a kid who's a redshirt freshman, hasn't played a down of scholarship football at all. So Florida also lost a lot of players to the NFL. They lost 8 that were drafted. Michigan had 11 drafted. So these two teams are very similar. I'll give the edge here, though, Michigan having a quarterback that they trust more than Florida does. So I'll put the odds of a Michigan victory in this game at 60%. Next, the game at Wisconsin against the Badgers. Now, I know a lot of people are very afraid of this game. Maybe I'm wrong. Listen, I have a lot of respect for the Wisconsin program, but I am very skeptical that unless it's just a fluke situation like what happened with Iowa last year, I think it's going to be hard, just like it's hard to beat Nick Saban as an NFL coach running pro-style schemes in college. I think it's going to be hard to do that with Jim Harbaugh, especially because he was a hell of a lot better NFL coach than Nick Saban was. So you're talking about a guy that when he left the NFL still had, among coaches that had coached there for at least 4 years, a top 5 all-time winning percentage. So I just look at Wisconsin, and I think they have a couple guys in the offensive line that would start for us. But really, I think in many cases, they're going to run the same thing we run, but with players that just aren't as good. So given my respect for the Wisconsin program, my respect for the tremendous home field advantage there at Camp Randall, I'll only put 55% odds on a Michigan victory. But for those reasons, I'm not as afraid of this game as many of you are. Next, as we run down Michigan's schedule, here's the surprise. A lot of you are going to be shocked that I don't have Ohio State the most difficult game. Now, that does not mean I don't think it's a difficult game. But even in Brady Hoke's years, when they were a lot better than us, we played them tough. And here, they're a lot like our team. I mean, they've got to replace 15 guys that they've lost early to the NFL the last 2 years. You know, they've got J.T. Barrett, who's had set more records at Ohio State than Wilton Spate has. But, you know, a lot of Ohio State fans are wondering about him at the end of the year. Who's their go-to receiver? You know, their defense is very similar to ours. Former highly recruited kid named Nick Bosa. They're expecting him to explode as a sophomore, just like we are Rashawn Gary. They're replacing a lot of guys in their secondary, too. I thought we were the better team last year. I thought we had some incredible officiating, I guess we'll call them inconsistencies. And then we had, I thought, some at times too conservative a play calling, a terrible pick six. I thought we were the better team and more talented team a year ago. So this will be a tough game, but there's a lot of intangibles here in Michigan's favor. The revenge factor, home field advantage. You know, the odds that Jim's going to lose to anybody 3 years in a row, and the situation's reversed as well. When you're as great of a coach as an Urban Meyer or a Jim Harbaugh, the odds that the same guy is going to beat you 3 years in a row just aren't very high. You're just too good of a coach for that to keep happening to you. So I'd put this game at 50-50. I think Ohio State is a little bit more talented, but I don't think the teams are that much different, and I think the intangibles are in Michigan's favor, especially if Ohio State comes into that game undefeated. How many times through the history of this rivalry have we seen Michigan teams do in undefeated Buckeye squads in that situation? Too numerous to mention. And that brings us to what I think is the toughest game on Michigan's schedule, and it's at Penn State. For all the reasons I think the intangibles line up in favor of Michigan against Ohio State, all the same tangibles in this matchup work against the Wolverines. Home field, whiteout, revenge. We embarrassed these guys last year. Guys and gals, it was 49-10, and it wasn't that close. All right? Their coach, James Franklin, called a timeout to kick a field goal on 4th and goal from the 2 because he was afraid of getting shut out. I mean, we just physically manhandled these guys. And this is a program that has a lot of tradition and a lot of pride. So literally every intangible in this game. James Franklin hasn't beaten Michigan yet. Every intangible in this game is in favor of Penn State. Plus, I think they have the more explosive football team on offense right now as well. So because of how good of a coaching staff we have, I'll give us a 45% chance to win. But even that might be a bit of a homer lane. So let us know, what do you think are the toughest games on Michigan's schedule this year? Tweet us at Michigan Podcast on Twitter. When we come back here on this week's episode, John Borton of the Wolverine is going to join us. Which of the infamous urban legends in Michigan fandom history are actually true? He'll confirm, deny, debunk. Tell us which ones are fake news and which ones are real, and we'll get his thoughts on this year's team next.
Bow formation, they go heavy. Parry the setback. 3rd down and inches. Parry! Touchdown, Michigan! Wolverines win it!
Back here on the Michigan podcast, and our featured guest this week is, and I mean this as a compliment, a grizzled veteran of covering the Wolverines. John Borton from The Wolverine is here with us. And John, it's an honor to have you with us here today on the Michigan podcast. Brother, go blue, and how are you?
Doing really well. Great to be with you.
You have seen it all, John. I mean, you've seen the transition from the Schembechler era to Gary Moeller, and the tremendous start his career got off to, and then the consecutive 4-loss seasons, the infamous incident in the suburban Detroit restaurant that led to his termination. Lloyd Carr brought in as an interim coach, wins his first game. I was actually at that game. 170 degrees, I think it was, against Virginia that day on a last-second throw from Scott Dreisbach to Mercury Hayes, and then Lloyd Carr has a Hall of Fame career. Then there's the clumsy, is it Les Miles? Is it not? We bring in Rich Rodriguez as an outsider. It doesn't work. Brady Hoke has 1 or 2 great years, and then after that, the thing falls apart. And now we've got sort of this Pax Romana of the prodigal son in Jim Harbaugh returning. As I kind of just introduce you with a "this is your life" sort of question, as you look back on all of these different eras you've had a chance to cover, John, what kind of stands out to you about that?
Wow, there's a lot of ground there. That you did a nice job of summarizing the last quarter century or so. I mean, there's so much that stands out. In those early years, you were looking at Michigan football dominance. You had a team those teams in the early 90s that could just run over people and were so dominant, and were completing the 5 in a row Big Ten championships. And you had guys like Doug Skeen that works with us today on the Wolverine, remembering, and flashing the 5 rings. 97 is certainly the pinnacle. To have an undefeated season, to go through all that and not, come through it untouched, that was very, very special. I talked to Lloyd Carr about it just a couple of weeks ago, or about a month ago, actually, for a football preview, and he chokes up about that group and talking about those guys. So yeah, it's there are some very special times. Obviously, you kind of hit the dark times in recent years with the changeover from Lloyd Carr to Rich Rodriguez, and it just seemed to everybody says bad fit, and I think it was, in terms of, okay, you're trying to go from pro style to that spread, and everything crashed, and then Brady Hoke comes in and he's trying to go back to a pro style with spread personnel, and it just didn't work. So to have Jim Harbaugh in place, you're looking at that renewal, that renaissance that Michigan fans have been looking for. Like, oh, please, let's just get back to the time when Michigan is expected to be at the top, and really you're getting there again. It's a situation this year where, okay, you put 19 guys into the NFL between draftees and free agent signings. So in the short term, you've got people saying, well, they might not get out of third place in their own division again. But you also have people picking you, as USA Today just did, number 4 in the nation. So the expectations have definitely gone back up for Michigan.
As you've seen the unveiling of Coach Harbaugh's version of the Wolverines, John, what is there right now that reminds you of when Michigan was that powerhouse? Do you see some similarities now, other than, of course, Jim was one of the great players to ever play at Michigan? But I mean, as a coach, the makeup of the program, the way that it operates, or is this just such a dramatically different era that it's just hard to make those comparisons?
No, I don't think it really is. I think you are in a situation where the same things are being emphasized. Great defense, being able to run the football, protecting the ball. There are so many things. It's so dramatically different than, say, the Rich Rodriguez era, where they wanted to outscore people, spot the ball, move things, go, go, go. Defense almost seemed an afterthought. And, it's more of a Pac-12 type of approach. Now you're back to, you play that great defense under Don Brown. You make sure you run the football. You throw, as they had 7 interceptions last year, a couple of very costly ones at the end, but they made it through most of the year with just just a handful of interceptions, and that is huge. And they protected the ball. They didn't fumble it to the other team. There's just an emphasis on not giving games away and a tough-mindedness. I just see a lot of what Jim is doing that harkens back to what Gary Moeller, what Lloyd Carr, what Bo Schembechler did. Now, Jim is absolutely his own man. Don't say that I'm trying to compare those guys in terms of personality or innovation. Jim Harbaugh just lives on his own planet in terms of being creative and doing all the things that you need to do these days to bring attention to your team, to bring attention to your program. You talk about the Rome trip, what incredible innovation, and he just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing the envelope and really making the NCAA react to him. He's not going to cheat. There are programs around the country that, as you and I know, will do that without a thought. He's not going to, so he competes by continually coming up with new ways to get attention from recruits for this program and moving ahead with a really creative program.
John, I definitely want to get your analysis of this year's team. John Borton of The Wolverine is here with us this week on the Michigan podcast. But I think you can tell from the opening question, I want to take advantage of the fact that you have had a watchman on the wall perspective of Michigan football for decades now. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you some questions along those lines, like we opened up with and like this one. When it was obvious after the loss to Ohio State, Brady's last year, and there wasn't going to be a bowl game, and there was going to be a coaching change. Just as a fan, I was very adamant on my own social media accounts and other that I really believed, looking at the way the 49ers were ending, that Jim was going to be the coach here. I didn't have any sources, any inside word. One of the things I do in my day job is I analyze potential outcomes. I run scenarios, just in another field, not sports, politics. And one of the things when I ran those same methodologies on the Michigan coaching search, the need that Michigan had for him was so overwhelming that just as an analyst, as a forecaster, I could not contemplate a scenario where they could come out of that need with anything other than what they ultimately needed, especially given the fact it was obvious he was going to be available. But for those of you that weren't doing forecasting or modeling or just, lobbying analytics from the cheap seats on their Twitter accounts like I was, but actually had to report on this stuff and put your names on it and be accountable for what you said, how confident during that process were you that Jim was going to end up being the coach here?
We were fairly confident early on and became more and more confident as time went on. It was a situation where we had people very plugged in who were giving us good signs, good reports, but there was always that cautionary, don't count on everything just yet. I mean, it's still a decision to make. It's still a situation where things could fall apart. Jim Harbaugh and Michigan had dealings once before, and it didn't work out. This time around, we felt very, very confident that Jim Harbaugh was going to be the guy. And as you say, he was the guy that was going to be the home run, the one that could instantly turn this thing around and get Michigan fans excited. Instantly turn this thing around and sell the suites in the stadium that were starting to really dwindle in sales. The guy that could instantly bring credibility back to Michigan football. And so, it was a situation where we thought it was going to happen, increasingly knew it was going to happen. But then it did, and so it was a kind of a wild process. You talk to people who are close to the situation, and there is a palpable excitement in their voice. This is going to happen, but at that same time there's that little bit of caution. Just be prepared, because nothing is done until it's done.
So I've got to ask you as well about some infamous Michigan message board urban legends, and all fan bases have them in this day and age. And you've been there for the advent. Of course, it was originally a paper, and then it became a website and multimedia as the technology evolved. So you've seen the advent of the message board era. So I, as a guy who has lived on these as a sports fan most of my adult life now, I got to ask you about some of these urban legends. Let's go to Coach Harbaugh's the search for the successor that led to Coach Harbaugh at Michigan. The urban legend that Bob Stoops was Plan B. Of course, he just retired from Oklahoma. You can tell me, is that true? Is it not true? There's smoke, fire, hard pass, if you think it's too uncomfortable to comment on. But what about the urban legend that Bob Stoops was Plan B?
I will say this to you. And again, you believe what you want to believe, but there were people who had some knowledge of the process that were insisting that Bob Stoops was a serious consideration, and that he had gotten attention. He might be a backup. Now, whether that was misdirection, maybe we'll never know. But that was a name that was spoken about prominently. I will say that to you.
Back in 2007, Kirk Herbstreit, because he's an Ohio State guy, sabotaged Les Miles coming to Michigan by jumping on College game day, the day of the SEC championship game, and announcing it with Desmond Howard, who was on the search committee as a former player there, acting as if he didn't ever hear the story before, and Les had agreed to come, provided they waited until the national championship and kept it quiet so he could finish with his team. But Herbstreit blew that whole thing up. That's another Michigan urban legend. Same ground rules for all these questions, by the way. Your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. I don't think if Les was going to come here, that would have derailed it. I don't think that Les was going to come here. And I don't think that he was going to come here, not because he didn't want to, but because that was not going to be an option. And, I don't want to go a whole lot farther than that into it, but there was much more opposition to Les Miles coming back to Michigan, although he certainly had some supporters, than there was for Jim Harbaugh. And even with Jim Harbaugh, there had to be some things worked out and some feelings smoothed over. As you know, even with Jim Harbaugh, there were some moments a few years back where there was some tough back and forth. And so, but Jim Harbaugh was a much more likely option than Les Miles. And I like Les. I remember when he was here. But there are a lot of people that say that just simply wasn't going to happen.
Phil Fulmer voted Michigan so far down in the final 1997 coaches poll that provided the margin of victory for Nebraska to edge us out there for that split national championship. Has there ever been any documented truth to that Michigan message board urban legend, John?
He denies it. Michigan people insist it's true. Take that for what it's worth. I mean, I would think that there's a good chance that Coach Fulmer wasn't looking to do Michigan any favors in that situation. And, he may have voted his conscience, or he may not have done what people said he did. But, yeah, that's one that a lot of Michigan people remember very well to this day. And my friend John Jansen, who was an All-American on that 97 team, likes to point to the fact, hey, look at the pros that Michigan had on its team. Look at the pros, the handful that Nebraska had on its team. He's quite adamant that Michigan would have won a game played between those two teams, and it would have been a great one. I mean, if it was in the situation today and those two teams had to go through the playoffs and face each other, I'd say that would be one of your more popular let's go back and do this again types of scenarios.
There once was a Michigan recruit who committed to the school and then the next day on signing day got up and signed with Florida State and said, quote, "I went to bed a Wolverine and I woke up a Seminole." Did that actually happen, John?
That actually did happen.
That urban legend is true.
That urban legend is true. He was Michigan, as a matter of fact, Help me out on the name.
Is it Travis Johnson? Is that who we're talking about?
Travis Johnson, exactly. It was Travis Johnson. But Michigan was actually delaying its press conference with Lloyd Carr that day because in anticipation of getting that letter from Travis Johnson in. But the longer it went, the more iffy it looked, and then we got the proclamation that Mr. Johnson had a change of heart, whether from on high or wherever he felt he got his inspiration. That was went to bed a Wolverine, woke up a Seminole.
And the greatest Michigan message board urban legend of all time. John, do you know where Kelly Baraka is today?
I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. But you know what? One of my my funniest stories, or most cringeworthy, in a Lloyd Carr press conference involved Kelly Baraka, because as you know, that was he didn't work out here. He got in some trouble. And that was a tough topic. And so we were in a press conference when people were grilling Lloyd Carr pretty hard about Kelly Baraka. And he had clearly had enough. And he basically said he was going to answer this. And it was going to be his last question about Kelly Baraka. And he made that very, very clear. And I was wanting to ask something about Larry Foote, the linebacker out of Detroit. And I had that all in my mind, but what came out of my mouth was, Lloyd, about Kelly Baraka. And
oh boy.
He paused and he froze and he gave that look like, yes, I am going to kill you, and I'm going to kill you right now. And I didn't even realize what I'd said, what came out of my mouth. Somebody stepped in. Maybe it was my good friend Angelique Changelis of the Detroit News, who still remembers that, by the way. But somebody stepped in and said, I don't think you know, and oh yeah, you mean, and it worked out, and Lloyd kind of melted back into the, oh, okay. But yeah, that was one of those. One way I'll always remember Kelly Baraka, even though I couldn't tell you where he's at right now.
You know, I had a chance to see that look from Lloyd Carr once. I don't get to cover the team the way you guys do, obviously, and plus I live in Iowa. But when I had a sports show in Iowa, I came to Big Ten Media Days during his tenure to cover the team, and it was my first time, John, and I didn't know kind of what the reporter decorum was. And you know, I'm a radio host. I'm looking for a long form interview, you know, so I'm going around to tables with my recorder getting 5, 8, 10-minute interviews with these coaches, not knowing they're supposed to be like press gaggles where you get in a question for a soundbite, right? And so I wait my turn. It's my turn up next to ask Lloyd a question, and I keep asking more and more questions to get like a full form interview to take back to Iowa. And when I got to question number 4, he gave me a look like, what planet are you from? This is not allowed here. It froze me, actually, to have him look at me like that. About an hour and a half later, after the press gaggle was done, they have the banquet, you know, and the autograph session, and I took off my sports talk host from Iowa hat, and I'm like, dude, the Michigan coach is here. I'm a lifelong Michigan fan. I'm going to go get a photo. So I walked over to where Lloyd was stationed to get my fan photo. He looks at me and says, hey, wait a minute. Weren't you the guy that was just ball hogging the press conference a little while ago? I said, yeah, I didn't know what the rules were. I just wanted an interview from my radio show. And he looked at me and he goes, his expression completely changed. And he said, you're a Michigan fan? You should have just told me that. I would have been a lot nicer to you, is what he said to me, John. That's
great. Hey, I've got a follow-up for you if you've got time.
Sure.
One of my moments with Lloyd, with whom, you know, I do really have a good relationship to this day and speak with. And he was so good to us over the years, granting us access and doing one-on-ones with us for our football preview. But there was one time of a little heightened tension because someone on our staff had written a column and it, you know, basically was criticizing Lloyd for not being more maybe forceful in eliminating some guys from the team who had gotten into trouble. Well, Lloyd had already cut couple people loose, defensive backs that had gotten in trouble in the late 90s. And that didn't set well with him. My name's at the top of the masthead, so he's calling me up.
Mm-hmm.
And the late, great Jim Schneider, who used to be the football SID, gets on the phone, and he says he placed the call and then was going to turn it over to Lloyd down the hall if I was in. And Jim knew what was coming, so he says, John, said, Coach Carr would like to talk to you. Are you there? And it was the greatest moment because he was going to allow me to get off the hook and all of that, at least for a few more days.
Mm-hmm.
I said, Jim, yeah, let's do this. Give him the phone. And so for the next probably 10 minutes or so, I held the phone out here and just kind of let Coach Carr knock himself out with a rather high decibel commentary.
Spirited feedback from a customer, from a reader, indeed.
Yeah. But that was one of the times that I'll always remember. But for the most part, you really didn't run into that much because Lloyd was great with us, but he would let people know if he didn't feel like they were doing right by his program. There's no doubt.
All right, let's before we finish this out, John, let's talk about this year's team. And I've said this on our podcast several times already. Just as a guy who loves college football, and it's one of the few sports that even when my favorite team is struggling, I will watch it every bit as much as and engage in it every bit as much as I do than when they're playing as well as they're playing right now. That's how much I love the sport. So just as an observer and who loves college football, not even as a fan, I think Michigan's the most fascinating team in the sport this fall, and here's why. Because, last year we had 4 teams make the college football playoff. All 4 of them played at least 9 true freshmen in the college football playoff. All 4 of them started a true freshman on the offensive line. Michigan will go into this year, into fall camp, with a 2 deep that we think is going to have 26 players that have freshman or redshirt freshman eligibility. Last year, Clemson won the national title. They had 24 of those guys. So Michigan's profile is similar to how, if you're talented nowadays in college football, just like in basketball, it doesn't really matter how experienced you are. We don't count returning starters like we used to in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s because certain schools, there's a tier of schools that are recruiting guys. When I look at Michigan's freshmen, these guys look like they've been in the program for 3 years from a developmental standpoint, but still, Jim's only had 2 of those recruiting classes, John, where the other coaches that are at that level, the Jimbo Fishers, the Dabo Sweeneys, the Urban Meyers, the Nick Sabans, they've been at this for 3, 4, 5, 6 years of recruiting at that level, of replacing that stable of talent. And so Jim is going to try to do this on the fly with 2 recruiting classes, what all those other guys have done with an extra year or 3 or 4 years to recruit. And I think the big question is, can he do it, John? So that's my first question to you about this year's team. Can he do it?
Well, I mean, do it in terms of winning the Big Ten, do it in terms of making the playoffs. I think if you do one, you do the other, but either is going to be a tall task, and here's why. First of all, with what you said, I agree with an awful lot of it because Michigan does have tremendous talent. You talk about, we need to replace so many starters, but when some of the replacements are kids like Rashawn Gary, who is stepping into a leadership role and who is going to be really, really excellent as one of the better defensive linemen in the country, it's not like you're throwing just any first-time starter in there. And Michigan has a lot of that. And they have Don Brown flipping the switches on defense, and he's going to have a great defense. But the fact of the matter is, this is a situation where Michigan is going to have some very, very tough games in the back end of the season, just like it did last year. And I think this team, I have said right along, if it gets past Florida in that opening game, which I expect it to, I would think that it's going to go into Penn State in the middle of the season at 6-0 and with a real showdown. But from that point on, you've got some games that could really tell the tale. You've got at Penn State. You've got at Wisconsin right before Ohio State at Michigan. I mean, you could get through there 6-0. And the plus side is all these young guys that we're talking about will have grown up so much more during that time. The downside is you really have to grow up because you've got the toughest part of your schedule coming. It's going to be no bargain in Happy Valley. I don't care what happened last year. You understand that Penn State was not the same team at the end of the year as it was in Michigan Stadium. And certainly, it's going to be tough at home. You go out to Happy Valley, I expect it to be a whiteout, a night game, all that kind of thing. And that's going to be a tough one. To go to Camp Randall 1 week before you have to take on Ohio State is going to be very tough. And Michigan still has to prove it can get past the Buckeyes. So I think, can Michigan do it? Absolutely. I think they're going to be in it right to the end. I think they will once again be in a situation where they're playing Ohio State for the right to get to the Big Ten championship game. What happens there? We're going to wait and see.
Final question, John. What is it that you're concerned about that you think too many fans and pundits are taking for granted about this year's football team? And then what is it that you're not nearly as concerned about as a lot of those same people right now are?
Well, I think one of my concerns is that defensive secondary is going to be just all new across the board. And, it's a high risk defense at times because you're committing a lot of people and you're really coming after people, and that means you have to defend in the back end. And if they are not able to hold up back there, I know people say, well, look at the front seven. The front seven's going to be great, and they're going to hold those guys up and let them grow up, and that's the hope. If you're a Michigan fan, that's what you have to watch out for. But I am going to be a little bit more believe it when I see it as to their progression. The one that I think Michigan doesn't have to worry about as much as certainly most fans I hear from is the quarterback spot. Because after the spring game, all the talk was, okay, it's Brandon Peters. There's no question about it. Wilton Speight can't get the job done. He struggled at the end of the year. He's not the guy. We saw that in the spring game. He threw interceptions. He threw bad interceptions. I think Wilton Speight's going to be a lot better than people think. Do I think pushes in the fall? I absolutely do. Do I think Peters might be more talented and have more long-term upside? I actually do. But Wilton Speight can be a very solid quarterback for this team, and I expect him to be the guy that comes out of fall camp leading this team against Florida and doing it better than people who are fixated on the end of last season and on the spring game think he will.
John, fantastic job. You've been more than gracious with your time here today. Quickly, tell our audience about the Wolverine football preview. You guys put this out every year, glossy format. I've had every one of them going back to when it debuted in 1996. When's it come out, John?
It is coming out. Should be on newsstands within the next week or so. And for people that want to make sure that they get a copy, if they don't see it in their area, you can always call our toll-free line, 800-421-7751. Get hooked up with an issue. It's one that you won't want to miss. We've got big stories about not only the year to come, and we break it all down, but the 97 team 20th year anniversary, and we go into a whole lot. We break down the opponents. It's one that you want to see, and as you know, it's one you can keep and put with all the others on the bookshelves down through the years.
I keep them all. I've kept them all. Every year you guys have published them. It's a great job you guys do every year. John Borton, thank you for joining us here this week on the Michigan Podcast, John.
All right. Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care.
And they come out in the passing set on second down and 16, and Cockerham from his own end zone is sacked. And is it a safety, or did he just stretch across the goal line? Safety for Michigan. James Hall wrapping up Billy Cockerham. Michigan takes the lead.
Must do is either unload the ball, throw it away, or run straight ahead so that you don't give up the safety. 1, 2, 3, 4. Plenty of time to unload the ball.
Lindy's college football preview is on store shelves now, and If you get the Big Ten edition, you get Gerry DiNardo of the Big Ten Network's comments on every team in the conference. Here's what he had to say about Michigan. Quote, Jim Harbaugh has succeeded in step one, energize the fan base and games against teams with lesser talent. The next step is more difficult for a team that has finished third in the division the past 2 years. Win the East, win the Big Ten, and compete for the national championship. Wilton Speight returning at quarterback is a major plus. The defense is still considered one of the most talented in the country, with only one returning starter on defense, though, and 4 returning on offense. Keeping pace with preseason expectations will be difficult. I don't have a problem with the majority of his analysis from Gerry DiNardo, and I'm not necessarily a huge Gerry DiNardo fan. Although, to be fair to him, I don't know if the Big Ten Network just handcuffs its analysts from giving actual opinions, or if his opinions are just that banal. But in this case, I think his assessment is largely correct. We don't know. I mean, we think we can know, given the amount of talent on the roster and who the coach is. We think we can know, but let's face it, we've got more questions heading into this Michigan season than, in terms of personnel, than maybe we've had since the transition from Lloyd Carr to Rich Rodriguez because of the scheme change. So now, pardon me, I think we're all a lot more confident about the guy at the helm than the circumstances that were going on in the program and the administration at that time. Nonetheless, though, there are a ton of questions. What he did say I have a problem with, though, can we please get rid of the all he's done is finished third in his division twice talking point? That is just weak. Weak. I mean, it's technically true, but there's no context there. As I pointed out when this has come up before, man, Urban Meyer's only won one Big Ten championship. I thought he was going to dominate the league. I thought he was going to come in here and show us what's up, give us a little SEC what for. He comes in here, it's been 6 years, he's won one Big Ten title. One. He ain't bad. He ain't nothing. He's 61-6 in the Big Ten Conference. So is it true Urban Meyer has only won one Big Ten title? Yeah, that's technically true. Does it provide the full context of the impact he has had in this league and the success he's had in this league? No. And the same applies to Michigan and Jim Harbaugh. Is it technically true he's finished third in the Big Ten East? Twice. Yeah. But in both of those years, he went 6-2 in the league. Well, actually, last year, the 9-game schedule, 7-2 in the league. So he's 13-4 in the conference. The only two coaches right now that have won more games in this league the last 2 years are Urban Meyer, the aforementioned, and Paul Chryst at Wisconsin, who dominates the weaker division. So he's been third in the division, but it's not like he's been 4-4 or 3-5. He's been one game away from winning the division 2 years in a row. Both years in a row, he played for the division championship that last weekend against Ohio State. So it's a weak take. And it's the kind of take you throw out there because you're sick of hearing about a guy, you don't like a guy, and I get it. That's fine. We're human beings. If you're Gerry DiNardo, you don't have to like Jim Harbaugh, but you know what you do need to be? A professional. And have an actual opinion that you can back up, that has some context to it, and not just some weak-ass hot take.
Double reverse, Alexander. A first down, he could go all the way. At the 25-yard line, gain of 31 yards. What is Michigan doing?
They are now running the ball. They're blocking. They are executing their offense like they have all season long. Now, hey, this is one of those that you got to remember how many times you're going to hand the thing off. The defense starts to pursue. You'll see everybody run to the top of the screen, reverse field. They try to go back and recover. By that time, Michigan's blockers were all in line over there, and Alexander couldn't outrun the angle.
So some of you may be wondering, hey, what's that thing we added to the set here on the Michigan podcast that's next to me in this little frame? It's this right here on your screen. It is the coolest Father's Day gift for a Michigan fan ever. And can you believe my wife was unsure I was going to like this? So apparently there's this website called Etsy. Well, if you're a female watching, you're like, well, no poop, Sherlock. I'm a dude. Crafts aren't my thing. Okay. So I didn't know what Etsy was, but apparently it's like the eBay of crafts. And one enterprising Michigan fan put up that the craft that you just saw the picture of, which looks like a doctorate from the University of Michigan in football signed by Jim Harbaugh and Ward Manuel, the AD. And my wife got me that for Father's Day, and she kind of sheepishly gave it to me. She's like, well, I kind of hope you like this. I wasn't sure what to get you. I looked at this thing. I'm like, are you kidding me? This is like the greatest Father's Day gift of all time. So I wanted to give props to my wife and point out that you too can go to Etsy and get one of these for you as well. Don't forget, at Michigan Podcast on Twitter. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe here on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. Back again next week, and go Blue.